This is the podcast of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. Welcome.
Welcome to a new episode of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. My name is Cláudia Baptista. I will be the research associate conducting this episode in conversation with Dr. Antoine Duval regarding this year's World Cup in Qatar. In this episode, we look to discuss some of the most controversial topics that have been surrounding this World Cup, which has finished earlier on this month. The topic of human rights and specifically workers' rights has been given a lot of attention during this time. Both FIFA and the Qatar World Cup CEO were under extreme criticism for not addressing the situations and for failing to consider in hindsight that they may arise when Qatar was a country chosen to host a sporting event. FIFA's regulations were furthermore contested in regards to the prohibition of the One Love armband, as well as some other prohibitions if facilitated to accommodate Qatar's traditional and religious norms. In face of this, both Qatar's workers' laws and international sports law have seen some amendments. It is worth highlighting that in 2017, the candidature procedure for countries bidding to host the World Cup was changed to include human rights criteria and requirements. These changes, however, did not come into force for this World Cup and will merely be applicable from 2024 onwards. In order to better understand these amendments and the treatment of human rights during the World Cup, we have the pleasure of receiving Dr. Antoine Duval for the discussion of this contested current topic. Dr. Antoine is a senior researcher at the Yasser Institute. He is also the founder and editor of both the Yasser International Sports Law blog and the Yearbook of International Sports Arbitration. He is also part of the editorial board of the International Sports Law Journal and the International Sports Law book series of Yasser Press. Dr. Antoine, thank you very much for being with us. The first question that I would like to touch upon is, FIFA, as one of the founders of the event, has been under great scrutiny. A question arises as to whether FIFA could have been better prepared for this World Cup, given that it knew beforehand the problems that it may face in Qatar regarding human rights. What sort of preparation did take place, and what else could have possibly been done?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss with you a topic that is quite close to my heart and to my research. And let's go directly into the heart of the matter. Well, one answer is that FIFA was never prepared for Qatar to host the World Cup. You may know if you have, for example, watched the recent Netflix series on that attribution. It was linked to certain financial flows. Some would call it corruption. That was quite unexpected from the side of, in particular, the then FIFA president, Sepp Blatter. And in fact, and that is also interesting to remember, the evaluation of the bid of Qatar by FIFA was quite mediocre, and the other bids that were competing against Qatar bids were evaluated much better. So I think this was, first of all, a surprise to many inside the organization. And that surprise is also reflected in the chaotic organization, the move from the summer to the winter. All the calendars had to be changed. So this is not limited to the issue of migrant workers. It's overall, this World Cup was an unexpected event. And on the migrant workers side, I think FIFA until now had always adopted the position that the labor law question is a question for the sovereign state that is hosting the World Cup. FIFA didn't consider, and that's a really big question in general, should FIFA actually be a regulator of labor law, internationally speaking? FIFA always said, we don't have employees in those countries building the infrastructure. Those people are employees from either local companies or global companies. I mean, you could look at the French Vinci company that is responsible for a lot of building sites. They are the ones that are immediately responsible for how they treat their workers. And this argument is obviously not entirely false in a way. FIFA doesn't employ anybody in Qatar until 2019 or 20, when a very small company is created between FIFA and the Qatar Organizing Committee. So why is that FIFA's problem? And I think what is interesting in the dynamic around the World Cup is that it became FIFA's problem. That lots of civil society organizations, lots of labor unions fought really hard to argue that FIFA had a responsibility to do something. And ultimately, after a lot of public criticism and certain legal processes, both in courts and before national contact points of the OECD guidelines, FIFA accepted some type of responsibility for workers that are linked to its events, but that it is not the employer of, in a way. So that is obviously an interesting development also in the broader context of the business and human rights discussion, in which you have a company that basically recognizes a responsibility for workers that are down its supply chain and that are not contractually connected to the company. And then obviously the question is whether that responsibility was translated in practice through an improvement of the labor conditions. Empirically speaking, I think it's fair to say, and it would be unfair to FIFA and Qatar, that things have changed. So you have had, especially on the legislative side, a number of laws that have come into place and have quite fundamentally, in theory, change the migration system and improved to a certain extent labor conditions, with a minimum wage being introduced, with a change in the way labor rights are implemented in Qatar. So there have been changes, and there have been also changes that were more directly connected to FIFA for the workers that have been working on the FIFA sites. So it's always difficult in Qatar because you have a lot of infrastructure being built, but you have workers that are working, let's say, on narrowly speaking FIFA sites, those that were building the stadiums, for example. And you have a lot more workers that are working on infrastructure that is relevant for the FIFA World Cup, but is not only limited to be used for the World Cup. And for the former, so the workers that were working on stadiums, FIFA did work with the organizing committee to create a very special private regulation of their labor rights. So they had a bit of a special status inside Qatar, with private audits being organized in conjunction with the international labor unions, with certain rights that were not really afforded to other workers. So you have to imagine a kind of an island, at least a labor law island in Qatar for the workforce that was working on those stadiums. But this is a very small number of all the migrant workers that are active. In short, there was no real preparation and anticipation of the different risks and problems that could arise. What we can say is that FIFA, after quite a long delay and a lot of public pressure, adapted and changed some systems that I think we could qualify as improvements in terms of the labor rights of those migrant workers that were in particular working on the stadiums, and contributed indirectly through the public pressure, but also maybe through indirect diplomatic relationships with the Qatari states, to some legislative changes. Then one of the big debates that we are having now is really about the meaning of those legislative changes in practice. Are they leading to a real implementation by the Qatari authorities? And here I think this is a bit where reformist progressive story and hits the wall of reality, where there are lots of indications, stories pointing at the fact that the labor law in Qatar is not really being enforced. The migrant workers are still facing huge discriminations, extreme difficulties to claim their rights. You still have a lot of workers dying because of the heat. So there are still a lot of empirical indications that point to the fact that the labor law on the books is still not being properly enforced. And that when you seek to enforce your rights, you are facing a really uphill battle. And you're much more likely to be expulsed without compensation than to actually obtain compensation before the Qatari institution.
The second question touches a bit more upon that bidding topic that you've just briefly mentioned. And it is it reasonable to believe that the change in the candidature procedure in order to include human rights considerations will make a true difference so that human rights will be taken into account or into further consideration by these potential candidates? Can we expect it to be an effective measure?
So here I might disappoint you quite heavily, but I think it's absolutely not reasonable to expect that these changes will have a very strong effect. In these organizations, and this is true for FIFA, it's also true for the IOC, it's true for any type of international sports governing bodies. These decisions are purely executive and purely discretionary. So you might have human rights criteria that might be listed, and I bet all bids will have a nice brochure about their human rights commitments and their human rights due diligence process. It was also true of Qatar on sporting grounds. You know, there were other criteria that were imposed, and Qatar was ranked last, and it didn't matter because ultimately this is a discretionary decision of the FIFA Council, and the FIFA Council is unlikely at this point to consider quality of the bid as a fundamental element for the selection. I think they will have a very small impact on selection procedures of future hosts. And then there is the question that is more fundamental. I mean, is FIFA really in a position to judge the human rights quality of a particular country? What are the indicators that it should use? Who should be consulted in that process? You would need to create a thick institutional process to do that in a legitimate way. And I don't think it is existing at all at this point. And then the question would also be, isn't it more productive for human rights, labor rights, to actually do give the World Cup to organizers like Qatar, and then have a massive debate afterwards to counter the sports washing by a kind of counter marketing in favor of human rights, like it was done in the case of Qatar, that could lead to changes and could lead to real reformist energy being driven by the PR risk that is connected to hosting the World Cup. So here, and that is a difficult question I find for myself, and from a strategic point of view, if you are believing in human rights, labor rights, what is the best in terms of achieving change? Is it to deny the opportunity to organize? Or is it to allow to organize and use that organization, media attention that it creates, the public attention that it creates, to try to drive change and to try to attract attention to issues? And Qatar, to some extent, provides us arguments, I think, for both. Arguments in favor of never provide the opportunity to a country like Qatar to organize the World Cup, because in a way it is also benefiting from a lot of sport washing. It has just triggered a huge infrastructural boom that has enhanced the risks and the harm suffered by a huge migrant workers population. On the other hand, those harms and risks were already present before. Nobody was talking about it. And the changes that did occur, because there were some changes, and the pressure that did occur wasn't really present before.
And now the third question is on, is FIFA's regulatory restraint on political expression during sporting events realistic when teams continue to make political statements or political actions nonetheless during, after, and before the games, such as, for example, the United States team taking a knee before every game, and FIFA applying no penalty or sanction to these actions. Is it realistic to keep having these restraints then?
So here we're talking about obviously a very different issue, which is how FIFA is engaging in the regulation of speech and speech of players, but also to some extent speech of fans. Is FIFA still regulating it? Yes, FIFA is. I mean, not everything is possible on a pitch, and the proof is those armbands that nobody really dared to wear. So FIFA is censoring speech and is deterring teams from expressing certain types of opinion. And again, the armbands are a clear example of that. The question whether FIFA has a double standard, legitimate one, in the sense that there are some types of expression that are allowed. So you can see the Moroccan team winning the quarterfinal and holding a Palestinian flag, and it's highly political. And you can see American players taking a knee, which is also a political gesture. So FIFA is not sanctioning every political gesture the same way, but it is sanctioning at least political communication and speech that is, I would say, permanent during the game. That raises question of the legitimacy of that censoring. So do we want a private organization like FIFA that controls monopolistically organized football to actually restrict our ability to speak about politics in the context of its competitions? And here FIFA's argument is to say yes, because football, and the same is true for the International Olympic Committee, football sport is not about politics, and we want to keep the politics outside of the stadium. In the stadium, we are just about sports. And others would say, and I'm more inclined in that direction, that football sports is highly political. I mean, that's why you see a lot of high-level politicians in stadiums. That's why you see Putin wanted to organize the Olympics and the World Cup. I mean, it is also because it sends a political signal. And when you win, there's definitely a sporting dimension to it, but there's also a political dimension to it. So it's really, and some would say it's really artificial to make that distinction. And we could create more spaces. And obviously here there is a debate about, should it be allowed to wear a shirt that is, displaying hate speech? Probably not. But should it be allowed to wear an armband that is a localized space where you express one opinion? I think it would be a proportionate way to allow for public speech without making it the center of attention, because still we are there to watch the football and to watch. So it's also about finding the right balance between the right to express your opinions and not disturbing the main purpose of the event, which remains one of featuring a sporting competition. It's about finding the right balance, and that is always difficult in law in general. I mean, when you look at human rights law in particular, a lot of it plays out under proportionality analysis, where you would discuss legitimate objectives for restricting certain freedoms, and the freedom of speech in particular, and finding the balance between the restriction and the interest, the legitimate interest that you're pursuing. And I think here the argument, at least from my side, would be that right now we are going too far in the direction of the restriction. So it's also a tricky question, but it's a fascinating one from a researcher's perspective, because you have private Swiss body that basically regulates the world on freedom of expression, but not only on many other things. But in this particular instance, we're talking about freedom of expression, and that raises obviously questions about the legitimacy of that body, about how that body is constituted, who takes decisions, how are they appealable, before what bodies, and so on and so on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Antoine. Thank you for your participation in our podcast and for interesting input on the questions. For our listeners, if you want to keep up with our work developed here at Nova Center on the Human Rights in the Environment, you can follow us in our social media and website. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and don't hesitate also if you're interested to reach out to me. I'm available on social media or by email for questions.